All right, so my computer cut me off. Let me pick up where I last was. So we were talking about medical doctors as an example in terms of conflict theory and structural functionalism and their perspectives, and how medical doctors organize to gain power. All right, so structural functionalists, as I said at the end of the last video, argues that doctors are considered socially valuable because Americans tend to value their health. Therefore, they want to attract the most qualified people into the medical field, and so they offer the greatest rewards. This argument is actually a little insulting to teachers and professors because think about it, we're highly educated, but we're not paid like medical doctors. And so it's this idea that medical doctors are valued, and you have to pay a lot of money to get the creme de la creme. Well, what are we, chopped liver? But anyways, that's my own little personal beef with that. It's like, we have to go through just as much education as medical doctors do. And if, people won't agree to go through that kind of training unless you give them a lot of money, then you're not even looking at professors because we don't make a lot of money. Well, engineer professors and business professors do, but those of us in the liberal arts don't. So, I find that particular argument personally offensive, but anyway, not the point. That's an aside. So, structural functionalists would say we value health, therefore we value doctors, therefore we pay them the most and give them the highest status and prestige to attract the most qualified. Now, conflict theorists would go back into history and they would say, well, medical doctors didn't used to be considered so important. Actually, professors and faculty used to be considered more valuable and had higher status and higher pay. The medical doctors did. This all changed in the United States around the time period just following the Civil War. So, what happened is we see the development in the US of the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association is a lobbying group, and they lobbied Congress at the end of the 1800s, to pass licensing laws. Now, there are some positives to licensing laws in terms of who's allowed to practice medicine and who isn't. At that point in time, there were a lot of scammers and con artists, a lot of people who were called snake oil salesmen. And oftentimes they were called that because they would be literally selling oil made from snakes as cure-all elixirs. Sometimes they were poisonous. Sometimes they had high degrees of lead and mercury and things that killed people or caused serious disabilities for the people who bought them. And there was no regulation, there was no control. And so the passage of medical licensing laws put those con artists out of business. Now, that's a good thing because that means there's greater safety for people in a society. However, there were other medical professionals, such as midwives. Now, typically, when you hear the word midwife, you think of it solely in terms of birth and birthing. Now, that is one part of what midwives would do. And there are still some people who are midwives today, but they are not licensed medical professionals. And so, midwives didn't just provide birthing services, but would also provide comprehensive medical care for women in general. Whereas medical doctors were, at this point in history, were all male. They only focused on men's health, and then they just assumed that the same would be true for women's health. And that's not the case. One classic example is in terms of a heart attack. A lot of people know all the, or most of at least, the symptoms that a man is having a heart attack, but a lot of people are unaware that the symptoms of a woman having a heart attack are actually different. For instance, for men, if you get tingling down your left arm and pain in the left side of your chest, those are big symptoms that you might be having a heart attack. For women, it can be backache and a persistent feeling of fatigue where you just can't get up and do anything, and you don't feel any pain in your left chest or tingling down your left arm. Um, and so, in this sense, with the passage of medical licensing, this ended up providing an economic monopoly to medical doctors, at which point they could decide to charge whatever they wanted for their services. Now, in the past, I mean, you get doctors would have to go to their patients' homes, and oftentimes they would be paid in things like livestock. Like somebody's sick, you call the doctor comes to your farm and treats you, and you give them a chicken as payment. I mean, that was how things work. Now you have people who are doctors who are making, hundreds of thousands, millions in some cases of dollars a year. Um, and it's because of these licensing laws and that medical doctors have an economic monopoly on healthcare. Now, this is starting to change, and doctors are starting to become employees of HMOs or health management organizations, such as large medical groups that are oftentimes run by business people, not by doctors. And so the private doctor that you could go to that had their own business. Now there are some that still exist, of course, but more and more are finding it difficult to compete for patients with these much larger HMOs who have worked out deals with insurance companies so that you have to go to the medical centers run by business people, not doctors, or your insurance won't cover it. And so there are all kinds of things like that that end up explaining why doctors still to this day end up making so much money. As this continues to occur and doctors are looked at more and more as employees, you're going to start to see the amount of money that doctors make starting to decline, as more and more of the money will end up going away from the doctors and to the business people who actually run the HMOs. And we're already starting to see this trend occur. So, I hope this gives you an understanding for what they mean about social change, just using the medical field as our example. The doctors ended up becoming wealthy and prestigious because they formed the American Medical Association and lobbied for a change in institutional laws that allowed them to demand whatever payment that they saw fit or wanted. All right. Now let's turn conflict theory to the question of divorce. Once again, we're dealing with the same kinds of time periods. We're dealing with the same kinds of issues. It's a question of how the data work together, right? So, industrialization and later World War II brought more women into the workforce. Now, oftentimes, World War II is talked about a time when women were first entering the workforce, and that's dishonest. Poorer women have always been a part of the workforce, and World War II had no effect on that one way or the other. If you were a woman, you were poor, you were going to be working. What it did was it drew more and more middle class women into the workforce. And so when you hear, World War II brought women into the workforce when they hadn't been before, well, they're not counting poor women. They're only talking about middle class women as if middle class women represent all women, um, which is obviously a fallacy. So, one of the things that this does, though, is that women did overall after World War II uh, experienced a degree of economic independence that they had never experienced before. And this means that women were now able to stand on their own 2 feet economically and didn't have to get married to be first taken care of by their fathers and then later taken care of by their husbands. And so, what this does is allows women to free themselves from male, masculine, or patriarchal authority and chart their own courses in life. So, if a woman's now able to stand on her own 2 feet, economically speaking, and she was stuck in a marriage that was, say, abusive or did not meet her needs, she now is capable of getting a divorce and still being able to survive and have a home and eat and, everything that she needs. And so the greater independence of women also ends up leading to higher rates of divorce for people who are separating, who otherwise wouldn't have separated in the past because of their mutual dependence on one another. So we see it's much more focused on economics, right? Now, here's the thing is that no one theory is the correct one. No one theory is the right one. And no one theory is the wrong one. Um, Theories are strongest when they work together. And the reason is because each one has a different focus and it's focusing on a different aspect of society. And humans and human societies are complex. They're diverse. One perspective is not going to be able to explain everything in a society. There's just too many variables to account for. And so, what we have are multiple theories that explain different aspects of society, which is why these theories are best taken together. There's an old parable of the 3 blind men and an elephant. Say, all right, it's a thought experiment. Say you had 3 blind men who had never experienced in any way an elephant before in their life. And the first, and they've never heard a description of it, they just know that a creature called elephant exists. One day, the 3 blind men come across one. So the first one ends up going to the rear of the elephant and touches the elephant's tail and says, "Ah, I know, understand now what an elephant is. An elephant's kind of like a hairy worm, a real thick hairy worm. That's what an elephant's like." The second blind man comes to the middle of the elephant and grabs one of the legs and says, "No, you have no idea what you're talking about. An elephant is clearly like a tree trunk. And I mean, just feel this. This is more like a tree trunk. I don't know where you got hairy worm from. That doesn't make any sense." And then the third blind man approaches the elephant from the front and touches the trunk and holds the trunk and says, "Tree trunk? Hairy worm? What are you two talking about? Clearly, an elephant is like a big snake, like a boa constrictor, or something along those lines, some kind of python. I mean, this is obvious, right?" And they're all using empiricism to a degree. They're using their senses, namely their sense of touch. And they are all three accurately describing parts of an elephant. But to get a full big picture of what an elephant is, you would have to put it together. And plus add some other information because those three perspectives by themselves, the python perspective, the tree trunk perspective, and the big fat hairy worm perspective, are not sufficient by themselves to understand the full picture of an elephant. But at the same point in time, they understand different aspects of it. And so, in a way, the 3 blind men are both correct about what an elephant is, and they're also wrong. And so, it's not that they're absolutely correct or absolutely wrong, it's that they're only able to look at one aspect. And because of the diversity of human society, to develop a social scientific theory, it's describing how a society works, how it functions, and what it is. You're going to need to bring in multiple theoretical perspectives, not just one or two. All right. Now we are ready to start looking at methodology. So, this is the other side. So when people develop theories, they use methodology to test those theories. So here's how it works. You have a theory, and the theory is based on data that's been gathered. And then the rules of logic and reason are applied to demonstrate and interpret how these data work together. So, what you then do once you have a theory is you generate what's called a hypothesis. A hypothesis is what a theory would predict two or more variables would how they would relate to one another. And so in this sense, then, theories are intended for hypothesis generation. Then you will use one of the social scientific methodologies that I'm about to start getting into to test the hypothesis. Now, say that you generate a hypothesis from a theory, and the hypothesis is supported by your research and by the data. You say, aha, I've proven the theory is absolutely true. No, you have found evidence that supports the theory. You have not proven anything because, as I've already said, patterns change and you can't possibly take into account every last relevant variable. So, in this sense, you have provided evidence for the theory. You have not proven anything. Scientists don't talk about proof. We talk about finding evidence to support a particular perspective. Um, I'll give you an example. So, Emil Durkheim, I've already mentioned how he did a full-length book-length study in depth on suicide. And one of the things that he predicted, that he called fatalistic suicide, is when society is so controlling that people don't feel like they have any choice in their lives, and everything is so controlled, and then they commit suicide to escape that. So this would be most common in, say, authoritarian countries, governments, totalitarian regimes, dictatorships, things along those lines. So I was talking about this with a class at one point in time. This was a few years back. And a student said, well, then wouldn't that mean that countries like North Korea would have higher suicide rates? And I said, yes, according to Durkheim's theory, that is one hypothesis that you would generate, that North Korea should have a higher rate of suicide than, say, a democratic society. And now, at this point in time, I didn't know what North Korea's suicide rate was. So I looked it up there in class. It's like, all right, we have a hypothesis generated from Durkheimian theory. Let's look and see if the hypothesis is supported. And it was. North Korea has one of the highest suicide rates of the entire world. And so Durkheim's theory then was supported by that evidence. All right. I hope you're understanding how this stuff works. If not, again, email me. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to clarify. So, the basic factor that's looked at in any kind of empirical study, any type of scientific study, would be a variable. And I've already been using the term variable. Let me define it clearly. It's anything that's, in terms of social sciences, it's anything thought to be significant for human behavior. Anything that can cause a change in human behavior from whether the variable's present or not present. And so, oftentimes when we're doing studies, we're looking at how different variables affect people and how they relate to one another, because variables impact other variables too and work together in very complex ways. So, the first thing we need to do is to develop a scientific definition for any variable that we're going to be discussing. This would be operational definition. It also is just referred to as operationalization. Sometimes it's referred to instantiation. But what this means is how a researcher defines and then measures a variable. Let me use a classic study. So there's a hypothesis that students, before taking an exam, if they eat a big breakfast and they have a high caloric count, that they do better on the exam than if they haven't eaten at all. So that's a hypothesis coming from nutritional sciences. Um, and so, say that we decide to test that. Well, the two variables we're looking at is the presence of a big breakfast and exam performance. And so, what we would want to do is we would break groups up into the control group and experimental group. And we would tell the control group, just go ahead and do whatever you would normally do. Or we might even tell them, don't eat breakfast before coming in for the test. For the experimental group, we would have them come in and make sure that they ate a big breakfast before the test. So that way we could get a good comparison between the two groups to see if there's any effect. Now, say that you have a researcher and they decide for whatever reason that they're going to define a big breakfast as having an apple. Well, for most people, a single apple and that's it. It's simply not going to be a big enough breakfast. Not only that, but apples come of all shapes and sizes, so you don't even know exactly how much they've eaten at that point. So typically, what we will try to do is use something that can actually be measured. Like we'll say, we're going to count a meal of 600 calories as being a big breakfast. Well, then you've just developed an operational definition of this variable. What is a big breakfast? And then you can call in your experimental group and make sure that they consume at least 600 calories before going in to take the test. Now, operational definitions and whether or not they have validity depends on how you're defining things. So, for instance, the researcher who defines a big breakfast as being just an apple, that doesn't have a high degree of validity. It's not actually measuring what a big breakfast, how that was going to impact the performance on exams. And so, in this sense, then, for something to have validity, it has to be truly measuring what you're claiming you're measuring. Then there is another really important concept called reliability. And reliability is about replicating studies. This is why in scientific studies we write up method sections so that other researchers can go in and replicate the studies that we have done and see if they get the same results or not. If they don't get the same results, then there could be a couple of things. They may have made a mistake, or you may have made a mistake. Um, and so if you made a mistake and you got certain results, but no one else gets the results that you got when they employ your methodology, then the study you did does not have high reliability whatsoever. So, now we're going to talk about some major research methodologies, 7 to be specific. Research methods, also called research designs, these are particular approaches to developing knowledge. So when you're building a theory, for instance, you're going to be going out and asking questions and gathering data and then trying to figure out how the data work together. And there are people who are constantly trying to generate new theories in this kind of way. And for those who have in the past, this is generally how these theories that we just were talking about ended up becoming established. So, and let's look at some of these. First one, survey data. Now, survey data is the collection of data by having people answer a certain set of questions. You all have done surveys. The U.S. Census is a survey. When you fill out student evaluations at the end of a course, that's a survey. Um, and so surveys are a common methodological tool in scientific research within sociology. Now, for survey, you have to define your population. Now, population is pretty straightforward. It's the target group to be studied. The sample, because typically, if you're looking at big picture stuff like sociologists tend to do, you're not going to be able to survey the entire population. Say you're doing a study on Americans. Well, there's over 300 million Americans. You're not going to get all what I think there's like 330 million Americans altogether. You're not going to get all 330 million of us to answer a survey. That's an unrealistic expectation. And so, what we do is we take a sample of the population, and you want to make sure that all individuals within a given population have an equal chance of being included within the sample. The reason we do that is because we want every group and every perspective that exists within a society as much as possible to be represented within the sample itself. So how do we do this? How do we make sure? We can't just go in and pick people because then that's going to write our personal biases into the sampling techniques. So what we have to use is random sample. And random sample makes sure everyone within the population has an equal chance of being selected. Now, random samples used to be very difficult to do because we humans are not very good at being random. Even when we try to be random, we typically aren't. And we subconsciously write patterns into almost everything we do. So, in this sense, then, random sampling has become easier in the computer age because computers can be random. You can program them to be random. And so random sampling is far easier today than it was before the computer age. Now, say that you want to look at specific groups within a given population. Then you would use a stratified random sample. So, say for instance, I wanted to do a study on college students at Lamar University, but I don't want to do a study on all college students at Lamar University. I just want to look at freshmen and seniors and make a comparison between those two groups, those just entering college and those about to graduate from college. Well, in that sense, then, I would do a stratified random sample where all freshmen and all seniors have an equal chance of being included in the study, but I stratify it and leave out sophomores and juniors. So no sophomores or juniors will be included at all. That would be stratified random sample. Respondents, exactly what it sounds like. People who respond to a survey. Now, we also have a difference in methodology between quantitative research and qualitative research. Quantitative are those things, exactly how it sounds, that can be turned into numbers to statistically see what kinds of patterns emerge out of the data. Whereas qualitative research, you can't get as large of a population. So, like Quantitative research, you could send out a survey with closed-ended questions where you have a Likert scale, where you have options like strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. That's what a Likert scale is. That's what it's called. Well, that's easy to turn into numbers and then calculate patterns using statistics. But at the same point in time, you might be able to ask a certain question and get an answer, but you can't go back in if you're doing quantitative research and say, well, why did you answer it that way? What was your thinking behind it? When you read the question, how did you understand the question? Now, this is where qualitative research comes in. This is where, for instance, in a survey, you might have open-ended questions where you ask a question and you give people a block of space to write their own personal answers to, and then you go in and you code those responses. Now, that doesn't typically lend itself easily to statistical manipulation, and you oftentimes then will be talking about themes. And so oftentimes you'll count up how many times a certain theme occurred within the answers or something along those lines. So even in qualitative research, oftentimes there's math involved. Now, particularly important for qualitative researchers, though it's also important for quantitative researchers, is to develop what is called rapport. Rapport is basically the level or the degree of trust that the people you're studying feel with you. So, how honest are they going to be in answering your questions is oftentimes going to depend on the degree of rapport or the level of trust they feel with you. And sociologists take rapport very seriously. And the reason is that most people, if they don't go to college, they don't, or if they do go to college and they don't take a sociology class, um, most people will never actually meet a professional sociologist. There's only so many of us that exist in the world. And so when you go out and you do a study, you might be the only sociologist that the people you're studying will ever meet in their lives. So not only are you representing yourself and your own ethics, but you're representing the discipline as a whole. And if you go in and you behave unethically and you violate people's trust, for instance, you promise confidentiality and then you end up betraying that and giving away people's identities, that doesn't just look bad for you as an individual researcher. That reflects negatively on the entire discipline. And so we take rapport and we take ethics very seriously. So, next methodology, participant observation. It's also called fieldwork. That's another name for it. Participant observation is basically what it sounds like. It's walking a mile in another person's shoes. It's qualitative research, and it's where you go and you participate with the social group you're studying. Um, uh, you observe what is happening and you take notes on it, and then you will code those notes later and start identifying patterns within people's behaviors and what ends up occurring. And it's kind of the idea that to really get a deep understanding of how a group interacts, you have to, at least for a period of time, become a part of that group and understand their norms, understand how they do things, understand their reasons for doing things. And so oftentimes sociologists who do participant observation takes a lot of time to do. I mean, for instance, when I was doing my dissertation, I did participant observation with bar workers. And I got a job working at a bar, and I worked my way up. I was first a bouncer, and then I was a swamper, basically a busboy. And then finally, I started bartending. And this didn't happen overnight. I was working at the bar for 2 years doing this research. And that's actually fairly typical for participant observation. So, doing this kind of research takes a lot of time because, just interacting with people for a short period of time, you're not going to get a deep understanding of how they operate. It takes a long time. All right. Number three, the third research design, case studies. Now, sociologists do case studies from time to time, but it's not the most common research method that we employ. The reason being is that it's an intensive analysis of a single event, situation, or individual. So you're looking in depth into something very specific. And typically in sociology, we want to look at big picture kind of stuff. And if you're looking at something very specific, you can't generalize to a larger group. You can only talk about that very specific group, person, area, what have you, that you studied. And so psychology is far more common. Psychologists do case studies far more often than we sociologists do. Secondary analysis. This just means you're analyzing data that you didn't gather yourself. So, for instance, if you're analyzing census data, which is really common for a type of sociologist called a demographer. Demographers are regularly will ask questions of data coming from the Census Bureau, and that's secondary analysis. They didn't go out and collect all the census data themselves personally, but the data exists, and they can then ask questions of the data and run statistical models to see what kind of patterns emerge. Number five, documents. Documents is kind of an in-depth analysis of uh, say, archival materials. It could be anything that's cultural or a social product. It could be photographs, movies, music. It could be material objects, like DVDs versus Blu-rays versus 4K Ultra. It could be about the content of the movies themselves. And so you could look at a particular genre of movies and find cultural patterns and ideologies being expressed within the genre, and you can find a pattern and then identify the most common ones. This would all be within the methodology of documents. Experiment, number six. Now, again, psychologists tend to do experiments more than sociologists do, but sociologists do experiments from time to time. Now, the reason why sociologists don't do them as often as psychologists do is because psychologists are more focused on individuals, whereas sociologists are more focused on groups, and particularly big picture groups. And so, say that you want to study you want to study the middle class in America. Well, you can't take the entire middle class in America and stick them in a laboratory and run experiments on them. That's a lot of people. So, what we end up seeing is, and I was talking about experiments just a little while ago with the whole big breakfast and test thing. So you use control and experimental groups and then dependent and independent variables to test for causation or correlation. Well, those are not the same thing, but you typically test for correlation and then later causation. First, let me define what independent versus dependent variable is, what that means. I've already defined experimental and control group. Experimental groups are exposed to the independent variable. In the case of big breakfast and exam performance, the independent variable would be the thing that you're introducing that's different. So you introduce to the experimental group a big breakfast. That's your independent variable. You do not introduce that variable to the control group. And then your dependent variable, what you're looking to see if the independent variable changes, would be exam performance. Now, these experimental designs can become very complex. And typically on the professional level, you're going to end up seeing multiple trials being run, and you're not going to see just one independent variable and just one dependent variable, but multiple independent and dependent variables. And you're not going to have just one experimental group and one control group. You'll have multiple experimental groups and multiple control groups because you want to get as much data as possible. Now, you also need to know the difference between correlation and causality. So, correlation is when things are related to one another. Statistically, we use a concept called Pearson's R. Pearson's R to measure correlation. That's how strongly two variables are related to one another. And Pearson's R as a statistic goes from -1 to +1. So if now one thing you need to understand is that perfect correlations, which would be a -1, a +1, or 0, almost never happen. Almost never. So 0 would mean there's no relationship whatsoever. And most things are related to one another in some degree. -1 would mean that every time variable x is present, variable y is absent. +1 would mean that every time variable x is present, variable y is also present. But like I said, you typically do not get these absolute correlations. Uh, there's typically multiple variables that explain any given results. So how do you go from correlation to causality? Because just because two things are related does not mean that one causes the other. So, in order for researchers to try to determine causality, you need to look at two basic things. The first one's pretty straightforward. Your textbook uses a fancy sounding term for it. They call it temporal priority. But if you break down what that means, temporal is just a reference to time, priority, what came first. So temporal priority just means quite literally what happened first in time. So, we live in the meso level of the universe. We don't deal with quantum mechanics where effect can come before the cause. Um, and in our experience of reality, the cause of an event always precedes or comes before the event itself. So, you want to establish what happened first. If something happened first, does that mean that that's what caused the second variable? No, you still don't know for sure. The second thing you need to do is you need to rule out the possibility of spurious correlation. So a spurious correlation is when two things are statistically correlated with one another. So statistically, they look like they're related to one another. But in actuality, they're both caused by something else or a third variable that you're not taking into consideration. And the two things that look on the surface to be statistically related to one another are not actually related to one another. So, in this sense, then, there's a classic example that was done. I want to say this was done back in the 80s, I think. It's almost 40 years old. Um, and the whole idea was to illustrate, to do kind of a mock study to illustrate the dangers of spurious correlations. So, the researchers who did this study, I can't off the top of my head remember their names. Um, Went and interviewed people in prison for rape. And they asked them about their childhoods, and in particular, their childhood diets. And what they found was that there was a high correlation with drinking milk as a child and become in America and becoming a rapist as an adult. Now, I know this is another point if we were meeting in class where I typically get gasps from students. Um, Let me explain why this is a spurious correlation. most American children grow up drinking milk, which means that drinking milk as a child is going to be highly correlated with everything an adult might do in the US. So growing up drinking milk as a child, sure, is highly correlated with becoming a rapist as an adult. It's also highly correlated with becoming a professor or becoming a medical doctor or a lawyer or a politician or a construction worker or a truck driver or an elementary school teacher or take your pick, because most American children grow up drinking milk. That means that it's going to be highly correlated with whatever people do as adults. And that's why it would be a spurious correlation. All right. Now, the seventh and last one that we're going to look at is unobtrusive measures. Now, unobtrusive measures used to be more difficult to gather. This is where you study people without knowing they're being studied. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can do it in terms of simply getting people to think you're studying one thing when you're studying something else entirely other, or just observing people without them being aware they're being observed. Right, and so I like to jokingly call this the peeping tom methodology. Of course, that's not at all what it really is. It's just me being silly. But at one point in time, if you set up a camera somewhere, people would notice it and it would alter their behavior. And so you couldn't trust the data that you might gather because people might change their behaviors just because they see a camera. Today, however, cameras are everywhere and people have become desensitized to them. And so you don't have to go into a public place and set up a camera to observe people. You just have to get access to the footage that is already being gathered by cameras that are all over the place in Western societies. And so unobtrusive measures have become very easy, and it's just a way to gather, and it's just a way of studying people um, in their natural habitat, so to speak, without them being aware that you're studying them. All right. Now, as I've already mentioned, ethics are considered highly important for sociologists. So I want you to pay particular attention in the readings to the rogue sociologist, the Brahua Project, and the Humphreys research. Those three examples are classic examples in terms of studies that have ethical issues. For the rogue sociologist, he kind of got too wrapped up in what he was studying and he ended up breaking the law. And now typically breaking the law is not automatically unethical in sociology. It depends on what you're doing. So if you're breaking a law in a way, like say for instance, like Howard Becker, he did a study on called Outsiders, where he studied back in the 1970s marijuana smokers, and he smoked with them so that they would trust him. And he did his research like that. Now, in the 1970s, wherever you were in the US, smoking cannabis is illegal. So he was breaking the law, but he was doing so he could build rapport with the group he was studying. Sociology as a discipline wouldn't consider that to be unethical. However, the rogue sociologist engaged in violence. He actually hurt people. Now, that is one of the things, just like medical doctors and their ethical rule, their number one ethical rule, first do no harm. The same is true for us social scientists. The first rule is do no harm. Don't hurt the people you're studying. And so when he engaged in violence as a part of a way to study gang life and gang behavior, the rogue sociologist crossed a line, an ethical line. The Brahua project is about confidentiality, and he had promised the people who participated in his research confidentiality. He was studying restaurant workers, and then the restaurant he was working at and studying burnt down. The police found out that he had notes, that he was a sociologist who was studying this, and they subpoenaed his notes, and he refused to hand them over because it would violate the ethic of confidentiality. Well, he was jailed for obstruction of justice. Now, he was eventually released when the police found the arsonist, but he never turned over his notes. He sat in jail rather than violate the ethical code of protecting the people who participate. And this is considered an example of good sociological ethics. The reason being is that say that you're doing a study on groups that engage in deviant behavior, and something happens where the police get involved and you turn narc as a sociologist. Well, people aren't going to trust you, and they're not going to trust any other sociologist either. So if you promise people confidentiality, you have got to follow confidentiality. You have to protect their identities, and in a way that's related to do no harm. Because if you do not protect your participants' confidential information, you open them up to potential harm. And that's exactly what the issue is with the Humphreys research. Now, Humphreys was studying men who have sex with other men, many of whom, and this is one of the early empirical studies that illustrated many of the men who would go and meet in public areas and have same-sex sexual encounters did not identify as being gay. They actually identified as being straight. But in order to find this out, Humphreys ended up going out into the parking lot of the tea room where men were meeting and taking down their license plate numbers, and then having a police friend of his, which is illegal, by the way, look up, contact the DMV and find out the names and addresses of the people who are showing up to the tea room. Then Humphreys altered his appearance and showed up to their homes and started questioning them, their health, posing as a health department official. And so the ethical issue here is that he gathered their personal information, and then he spread it to other people. Other people knew this personal information, knew what he was researching. And this was in 1971. This was a time when gay and lesbian people were being locked up in psychiatric institutions that were really prisons, and being subjected to all kinds of tortures, such as waterboarding, electrocution to genitalia while showing same-sex pornography, all in the name of aversion therapy, as well as all the way up to an ice pick lobotomy where they scramble the frontal lobe of someone's brain. And so all of that was ended with the publication of the DSM-4 in 1973 that ended up taking out homosexuality as a mental illness. And so sexuality is, whatever your sexuality is, it's not considered a mental illness whatsoever, but just a normal expression of human sexual expression. So, in this sense, then, Humphreys exposed his participants to very potentially serious consequences. All right. Oh, and by the way, all those techniques that were used to try to cure the gay, um, either left people as vegetables, where they're technically alive, they're breathing, their heart's beating, but there's just no one home, or it just completely destroyed someone's sexual desires altogether. So it didn't make people straight. What it did was it cut them off from really important aspects of what it is to be human. So, three major historical stages of sociology. Up to the 1920s, there's mainly a focus on reforming society. 1920s to World War II, focus on pure research, particularly coming from the influence of Talcott Parsons. World War II on, focus on both basic and pure sociology as well as applied sociology. There's still debates about that in sociology, in the sociological field, about whether or not sociologists should be involved in things like activism. That's an ongoing debate in the field. So, the new trends in sociology, first one, globalization, which is the extensive interconnections between nations. This would be international law, for instance, international trade deals. The UN would be an example of it. The way that goods and services are transmitted around the globe from one nation to another. These would all be aspects of globalization. Now, globalization is here. So, whether you like it or you don't, it exists. Then we have globalization of capitalism. Now, in the past, there's been multiple ways of organizing an economy. In capitalism, there's many different types of capitalism, even. And we can see, looking around the world, capitalism as an economic system is now globalized in the dominant economic form, but not every society practices the same type of capitalism. So, for instance, capitalism is generally run by economic elites in the United States, whereas capitalism is a state run economy in, say, mainland China, as an example. That doesn't mean that they're not capitalist, it's just different styles or ways of doing capitalism. So, this ends chapter one and the review for chapter one. In the next video, we will start on chapter two. Best wishes to all.